On a Thursday morning in late June, two lifelong friends named Dorothy Whitfield, 74, and Carol Ann Sims, 71, turned off a paved Arizona highway onto a remote dirt road neither of them had driven before, chasing a shortcut a gas station attendant had mentioned the day before. 9 miles down that road, in open desert with no other traffic, no cell signal, and no one expecting them for another 2 days, their car's right rear tire blew out. They had a spare tire in the trunk. They also, without either of them ever fully realizing it, could have kept driving on the flat tire itself, slowly, on the rim if necessary, back toward the highway. Instead, believing a flat tire meant the car could not move at all, they stopped completely. This is the story of the decisions made and not made across those days in between. Dorothy and Carol Ann had been friends for over 40 years, having met as young mothers in the same Phoenix area neighborhood, and had kept up a tradition, well into their 70s, of taking a road trip together every summer, usually short, close to home, often revisiting places they'd been years before. Neither had significant outdoor or wilderness experience. Their trips were built around scenic highways, small-town diners, and the kind of unhurried, conversational travel two old friends enjoy together, not backcountry driving or desert survival of any kind. This particular trip had started as a simple overnight visit to a small town roughly 3 hours from Phoenix, chosen mostly because Carol Ann had family history there and wanted to see it again. On the drive back the next morning, a gas station attendant, making conversation, mentioned an old dirt road that supposedly cut a scenic and considerably shorter route back toward the highway than the paved route they'd come in on. Neither woman thought to question this advice closely or to check it against a map with any real scrutiny. It sounded, in the moment, like the kind of small local knowledge that made a trip more interesting, the type of detour they'd always enjoyed taking together. Dorothy, driving, turned off the highway onto the dirt road a little before 10 that morning. The road was unpaved, rough in places, and considerably longer and more remote than either woman had anticipated based on the attendant's casual description. It wound through open, sparse desert terrain, creosote bush, scattered saguaro, distant mountains, with no other vehicles, no structures, and, though neither of them checked at any point in the first hour, no cell signal from the moment they'd turned off the highway. They had not told anyone specifically where they were going that day, beyond a general sense communicated to Dorothy's daughter the day before that they'd be heading back sometime Thursday, maybe Friday. No one expected to hear from either of them with any urgency for at least another day or two, a common and, until this trip, entirely harmless pattern for two friends used to loosely scheduled travel together. In the trunk of the car, a spare tire, still inflated and road legal, a jack and a tire iron, a complete, functional set of everything needed to change a flat tire on the roadside. Had either woman known how to use it or thought to attempt it? Neither did. And this gap, a purely practical mechanical skill neither of them had ever needed to learn in over 50 combined years of driving, since both had always had a husband, a son, or roadside assistance available for exactly this kind of situation, would become the single most consequential absence of the entire trip. At roughly 10:40 that morning, close to 9 miles down the dirt road, the car's right rear tire blew out, a sudden, loud bang followed by the unmistakable pull and thump of a flat, likely caused by a sharp rock or debris common on unmaintained desert roads like this one. Dorothy brought the car to a stop, both women shaken but uninjured. They got out, looked at the tire, visibly flat, the rubber collapsed against the rim, and, in a conversation that would define the rest of the day, concluded between themselves that the car could not be driven any further in this condition. This belief, though understandable for two women with no specific mechanical background, was not entirely accurate. A vehicle can, in fact, often continue to be driven on a flat tire, particularly at low speed over a short distance, even in a genuine emergency on the rim itself if the tire has come apart completely, at the cost of wheel damage but not at the cost of mobility. It is not the safest or most advisable way to drive, and it risks damaging the wheel and suspension, but over 9 miles of flat desert road, At a slow, careful pace, it represented a real and viable option to get back within range of the paved highway, and, with it, passing traffic and cell signal. Neither woman knew this. To both of them, a flat tire meant simply and completely that the car was no longer capable of moving. It did not occur to either of them to attempt using the spare, unfamiliar with how a jack worked or unwilling to attempt the process alone on a deserted dirt road. And it did not occur to either of them that the flat tire itself might still get them somewhere, however imperfectly. They decided, reasonably given what they believed, to stay with the car and wait for help to arrive. Broadly sound advice in many stranded vehicle situations, since a vehicle is easier for search efforts to spot than a person on foot, and staying put avoids the serious risks of walking through open desert without adequate water. What made this particular version of that decision so dangerous was almost entirely a matter of information. They believed, incorrectly, that someone would notice their absence and begin looking relatively soon. In reality, given what they'd told Dorothy's daughter the day before, no one would have any specific reason for concern for at least another full day, likely longer. They had, between them, a partially full gallon jug of water they'd bought the previous afternoon, now down to less than half after the drive, along with a small bag of snacks, crackers, a few pieces of fruit, nothing resembling the kind of provisions meant to sustain two people for an extended, unplanned stay in extreme heat. They spent the remainder of that first afternoon in the car with the windows cracked, conserving what water they had, checking Dorothy's phone periodically for a signal that never came. The temperature that day, typical for late June in this part of Arizona, climbed well above 100 degrees by early afternoon, and while the car offered some shade and shelter from direct sun, a stationary vehicle in extreme desert heat, without air conditioning running for any sustained period given concerns about the battery and fuel, becomes its own kind of heat trap, interior temperatures climbing considerably higher than the ambient temperature outside. By evening, with no vehicles having passed and no signal found, both women were growing seriously concerned, though neither wanted to voice the full extent of that concern to the other. They rationed the remaining water carefully through the first night, sleeping in the car's reclined seats, and woke the next morning still alone on the empty road, water supply now critically low. By midday on the second day, the water was essentially gone. A few remaining sips, carefully divided, and nothing more. Both women were showing clear signs of significant dehydration, headaches, dry mouths, a fatigue that went beyond ordinary tiredness, and, for Dorothy in particular, whose overall health was somewhat more fragile than Carol Ann's going into the trip, an increasing weakness that made even getting out of the car to look around feel like a considerable effort. It was sometime that afternoon that the two friends made the decision that would separate their fates. Carol Ann, the stronger and more mobile of the two at that point, proposed that she walk in search of help. She'd noticed, or believed she'd noticed, what might have been a distant structure or windmill on the horizon in one direction, the kind of marker that, in this part of rural Arizona, often indicates a ranch, a well, or some form of human presence nearby. Dorothy, exhausted and increasingly unsteady, would stay with the car, both out of genuine physical inability to attempt the walk herself and because it represented to both of them the more defensible plan. Someone should remain with the vehicle in case a passing driver or search effort came through, while the other went to actually find help. They said goodbye sometime in the early afternoon. Carol Ann, carrying nothing but the last few sips of water divided between them and no real supplies of her own, set out on foot across open desert terrain toward whatever she believed she'd seen on the horizon. She never returned. In the hours and eventually days that followed, Dorothy remained in the car, waiting for her friend to return, growing progressively weaker as severe dehydration, compounded now by more than 48 hours without meaningful fluid intake in extreme heat, continued its physiological toll. The human body, deprived of adequate water for this length of time in high heat, moves through an escalating and increasingly dangerous cascade. Reduced blood volume placing mounting strain on the cardiovascular system, organ function beginning to decline as blood flow to kidneys and other systems is prioritized away in favor of more immediately critical functions, and, as dehydration becomes truly severe, disorientation and confusion setting in as even brain function is compromised by the lack of adequate blood volume and ultimately adequate hydration at the cellular level. Dorothy, by every reasonable reconstruction of the timeline, held on to consciousness and a fragile kind of hope for at least another full day after Carol Ann set out, checking the road periodically, watching for any sign of her friend returning or of any vehicle at all. There is no way to know, and no way this story can responsibly claim to know, exactly what her final hours looked like, or exactly when she stopped believing help was still coming. She was found, days later, in the passenger seat of the car, having died from the effects of prolonged severe dehydration and heat exposure, still positioned in a way searchers would later describe as suggesting she had been watching the road, waiting. The alarm was eventually raised when Dorothy's daughter, unable to reach her mother for several days beyond what even their loose travel plans had suggested, contacted local authorities. A search was organized once the two women's general planned route became clear, though the specific dirt road they'd turned onto, based on a casual gas station recommendation neither had mentioned to anyone beforehand, was not immediately obvious to searchers working from the far more limited information available to them. The car was located after several days of searching, well off the main route either woman had told anyone about, discovered eventually through a combination of aerial search patterns and the slow process of checking lesser-traveled roads branching off the highway corridor between the two towns. Dorothy's body was recovered from the passenger seat. Carol Ann was never found in the car, and an extensive ground and aerial search of the surrounding desert, conducted over the following days and weeks, did not locate her either. A searcher's effort complicated significantly by the open, largely featureless terrain, the days that had already passed before the car itself was even located, and the wide radius of possible ground she could have covered on foot before whatever ultimately happened to her. Weeks later, a rancher checking a rarely used well several miles from where the car had been found reported disturbed ground and a scattering of personal items near the site, items that, once examined, were determined likely to have belonged to Carol Ann. Whether she had reached the well, found it dry or otherwise unable to sustain her, and continued on from there, or whether the items simply marked the furthest point of a journey that ended somewhere nearby without a body ever being recovered, was never conclusively determined. She was never found. Every piece of what happened to Dorothy and Carol Ann traces back to gaps in a specific, narrow kind of practical knowledge that neither woman had ever previously needed in over 50 combined years of careful, ordinary living. How to change a tire, whether a flat tire truly means a car cannot move, and how quickly and how completely cell coverage disappears once a road leaves the immediate corridor of a highway. A car, even on a flat tire, can very often still be driven, slowly, carefully, at real cost to the tire and wheel, but often still capably enough to cover real distance back toward help. Neither woman knew this, and the belief that their car was entirely immobilized, removed, from the very first hour of the ordeal, the one option that most directly could have gotten them both back to safety together, rather than splitting their chances between a car that offered shelter but no route out, and a walk that offered a chance at reaching help but no guarantee of surviving the distance required to find it. Telling someone a precise route and expected return time, rather than a general sense of sometime Thursday, maybe Friday, is one of the simplest and most consistently life-saving practices in any kind of remote travel, and its absence here meant that even a well-organized search effort began its work days later than it otherwise might have, and the decision to split up, born from genuine care for each other and a reasonable-seeming division of roles under desperate circumstances, is one of the most difficult and most understandable choices two people in this situation can make, and also, according to most wilderness survival guidance, generally one of the more dangerous ones, since it multiplies the ways a situation can go wrong rather than concentrating a shared set of resources, however limited, around a single, more easily located point. Dorothy waited for her friend to come back for as long as her body allowed her to. Carol Ann, by every trace left behind, appears to have kept moving, kept trying, for longer than most people could. Neither piece of that, the waiting or the walking, was the wrong choice, exactly. They were simply the only choices left by the time either woman fully understood how much trouble they were actually in.